everyone and welcome to LewisFiction and welcome to What If Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man joined the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I've done a similar video like this way back when, almost like 5 years ago now on my main channel during lockdown. I wanted to revise this and revamp this idea in the modern era. So what would happen if Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man joined the Marvel Cinematic Universe when it began, instead of holding out for Tom Holland's Spider-Man that came a whole 7 years later? Let's dive straight into this. We kick off our story in 2008 and Marvel have just launched their brand new cinematic universe with Iron Man. However, instead of working with what they have, Feige in this version of events will be slightly worried that the MCU doesn't have enough firepower for a full-fledged cinematic universe with the rights of the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man all at different studios. Feige approaches Fox first to try and include the F4 and the X-Men into the MCU, thinking a combination of them with the Avengers could be absolutely legendary for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. However, Fox reject him, thinking about their own success. However, one studio that is struggling with their fourth installment is Sony Pictures with Spider-Man 4. Since Spider-Man 3, Sony have been struggling with the fourth film, with director Sam Raimi not being happy with the script and the story in general. Adding Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man into this new universe would be a risk, but could elevate the story to new heights that Sony want. Marvel approached Sony about this idea, and Sony like it. Sony approached Sam Raimi to see what he thinks about this, and Raimi at first isn't so keen on the idea. Raimi is only interested in making movies about Peter and his story, and doesn't really like the idea of other characters and stories and narratives polluting his movie and dragging it with studio interference. However, Sony end up coming to a deal with Sam Raimi. If they put Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man in the MCU, they will let Raimi have full creative control on characters and stories that will be used in his individual films, as long as the films can acknowledge that they are in a Marvel Cinematic Universe and in a wider base of stories. The caveat is that he has to leave narrative room for Tobey's Spider-Man to appear in Marvel's ambitious project, The Avengers. Raimi accepts this and all parties are happy. And before you know it, just as Iron Man 2, Thor, Captain America the First Avenger, and The Avengers are all announced as upcoming Marvel films, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is now chronologically a part of the Marvel Universe, as it's also announced that Tobey Maguire will be playing the character in The Avengers after signing a 2-movie deal. No word yet is given on Spider-Man 4, but the universe plays out relatively the same, except some exceptions are given to include Spider-Man thematically into the universe, with different projects referencing him either in the post-credit scenes or just throughout the films in general. This also gives time to Sam Raimi to work on the fourth film until he is happy. One thing that Sam Raimi has vocally said about Spider-Man 4 in the real-life version of events is that Sony wanted to rush the production and get it out for 2011, but Sam Raimi was still working on the story and the script and was never actually happy with the way things planned out. So giving him until after the first Avengers movie means that he most likely will have things figured out and will be happy with the story. The first Avengers film releases to a massive success, and the addition of Tobey Maguire's webhead only adds to the weight of the film. And finally, 6 years on, in 2013, releasing as part of Phase 2, Spider-Man 4 will release. Not only did Raimi have enough time to be happy with the script, but due to the deal with Sony Pictures, Raimi was allowed to use whatever characters he wanted in the story. The story of Spider-Man 4 will follow after the events of Avengers 1, and similar to Spider-Man Homecoming, Adrian Toomes will gather tech from the alien invasion to build his criminal empire. Peter will go through trials and tribulations as he meets Felicia Hardy, aka Black Cat, who throws another spanner in the works for his relationship with MJ. Raimi is overall happy with the film, as he's able to use themes and ideas that he originally had for the film before it was eventually added into the MCU. Peter ends up eventually defeating the Vulture in this film, and Peter and Mary Jane will finally get married at the end of the movie. This film is met with overwhelmingly positive reviews, and is the most successful Spider-Man film since Spider-Man 2. With that, discussions immediately begin to extend Tobey Maguire's time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with more Avengers movies and more solo films as Spider-Man. And thus a 6-film contract with Tobey Maguire and a 4-film contract with Kirsten Dunst are signed for more appearances. Spider-Man 5 and 6 are greenlit to take place, one at the beginning of Phase 3 and another towards the end of Phase 3. Skip forward to 2016 and to Captain America Civil War. This is where the landscape of the MCU starts to rather change and look drastically different with the inclusion of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. Of course, Spider-Man in the comics has a massive role in Civil War, and I imagine the same would relatively be the same here. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man will actually be a massive and integral part of this universe, and therefore will be a massive character in this version of the story. The film will still follow Iron Man vs Captain America, however the film won't be as successful as it was in real life. This will be the first dampener Tobey's Spider-Man has on this version of the MCU. Tobey's character is so influential, and Sony are pushing and pestering Marvel to give him as much attention as possible. Thus, Captain America Civil War suffers from a slight studio interference as the Russo brothers try to accommodate some of the story towards Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker. And even though in the actual comic books, Spider-Man is a massive part of the Civil War story, the way the Russo brothers were leaning towards was more of a story dedicated towards Captain America, Bucky Barnes, and Tony Stark. And there wasn't really a lot of wiggle room for Spider-Man to have an integral part in the story. But like I said, the pressure from Sony Pictures and the big name that Tobey Maguire is as Spider-Man forces the Russo brothers to sort of include Spider-Man in the film as much as possible. Either way, apart from this very drastic change to the film is still relatively successful as Phase 3 is kicked off in the MCU. Civil War is directly followed by Spider-Man 5, which shows the effects that the Accords have on street-level heroes. Once again, Sam Raimi comes back to direct, and he uses the MCU's current state to tell a meaningful street-level and emotional story. He uses Dr. Connors, aka the Lizard, as the villain during this film, as Connors will be a prominent character as Peter gets a job as a teacher at ESU, where Dr. Connors has been working throughout the franchise so far. Another thing to consider is that Peter is getting older now at this point in the universe, as Tobey Maguire at this point in 2016 would be around 41 years old. Therefore, Sam Raimi decides it's time to tell an older story with Spider-Man and with this character. Peter will also be looking to buy a house and settle down with Mary Jane, but the constant bashing of Spider-Man after the Accords in Civil War force Peter to focus on his priorities elsewhere, which causes most of the character conflict in this film. Not to mention, this film will also end with the death of Aunt May, as Peter's life overflows with negativity. Peter is at the lowest he's ever been, and only MJ is there to pick him back up. Marvel at this point realised that Tobey Maguire won't be Spider-Man forever, so start planning for the future with Sony Pictures, as Sam Raimi and Maguire only have one film left. Discussions are had originally about retiring the character for good, but both Marvel and Sony eventually come to the decision that post Phase 3 of the MCU, they should try and continue the Spider-Man name. Two options are put forward: Peter's daughter Mayday, or potentially Miles Morales, a newish character just introduced in the Ultimate Comics a few years ago. Ultimately, the decision is to go with Miles Morales as casting begins. Raimi is brought into the conversation to ask on his ideas for the situation. Raimi says that after Spider-Man 6, he will step down for the character, and wants the 6th film to be a big send-off as far as he's concerned for Peter Parker. However, Sony and Marvel suggest that he should include Miles Morales in the 6th film to allow the studio to pass the torch to the next era of Spider-Man. Raimi does like the idea, but isn't fond of how constricting that may be to Peter's character in the 6th film, scared that maybe a potentially more exciting and new Spider-Man might overshadow his already fleshed out character. Skip over to 2018 and Avengers Infinity War commences. This plays out almost exactly the same, with Spider-Man just being a bigger part of the story. Skip to early 2019, and the 6th and final Spider-Man film is released just before Avengers Endgame. This film will be a precursor to Avengers Infinity War, as Sam Raimi has his last solo and emotional hurrah with Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker. However, Miles Morales doesn't end up appearing in the film. Per the deal Raimi had with Sony Pictures, he decided not to include Miles Morales in the 6th Spider-Man film. The reason for this is that Raimi wanted full control and decided to focus all his efforts on Peter for his final story. The story would see Peter and MJ settling down with a house and the birth of their first child, as the character has come a long way. The main villain would be Bruce Campbell's Mysterio, as his illusions take Peter throughout moments in his life, reminding him of what he's lost. The story will be about Peter having to focus on what he's gained and the life that he now has, with the birth of his daughter being a representation of the brand new life that he now lives. However, per Marvel and Sony's request, Sam Raimi does eventually include a post-credit scene and multiple references to Miles Morales, eventually introducing him into the universe, setting up a passing of a torch moment to happen in the future post-Phase 3. Avengers Endgame commences in 2019, and Tobey Maguire's Peter is just as much as a massive player as the rest of the OG Avengers, since he wasn't snapped away in Avengers Infinity War. In the final battle, Iron Man still snaps to save the day, but Tobey will be a massive part of that final battle. After the end of the film, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man will retire, hanging up the Spider-Man costume forever, in the same vein that Captain America does, passing the torch to Sam Wilson. With a brand new responsibility to his daughter and his wife, Tobey Maguire finally hangs up the mask. Phase 4 and beyond would see Miles Morales be introduced into the universe, with a brand new director, as Sam Raimi would also step down as well. Miles would become a staple of the MCU, following in the Legend's footsteps. Of course, when Secret Wars and Doomsday eventually roll around in 7 years' time, Tobey Maguire, I assume, would return for a few more appearances to help in the universe's greatest battle. But apart from that, this is where his story ends, and that is, what if Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man was in the Marvel Cinematic Universe?